Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. As the violence intensifies on the ground, the diplomatic tension has been ratcheted up a further notch in Ukraine. Russia's foreign minister, mouthpiece of Vladimir Putin, is accusing NATO of waging a war by proxy. Sergei Lavrov added that the threat of World War III has never been so real. No mention of how Russia's invasion of Ukraine, former Soviet state of course, but independent and sovereign since 1991, has created this whole hellish situation. We're here to discuss what is happening. On the set, we have Jean de Gliniesti, who's Director of Research at IRIS and former Ambassador to Russia. Thank you, sir, for being with us. Joining us by Skype from London, Aglaia Snekov, lecturer at UCL and author of the book on Russian security policy, and Vladimir Putin. Thank you for being with us. By Skype from Kyiv, Peter Zalmayev, Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Peter, thanks for joining us, sir. And in a studio in Washington, joining us by satellite from Washington, Christine Betzina, Senior Fellow and Head of Geopolitics Team at the Alliance for Security Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Thank you all for joining us. Before we start, let's get more on the defense of Ukraine and that special meeting that took place in Germany, hosted by the US. A report here at France 24 from Yinka Oyatade.
Ukraine is preparing to face off against a full-scale Russian assault in the east, and Western powers want to make sure Kyiv's forces are ready. During defense talks at the US's Ramstein air base in Germany, where representatives from more than 40 countries were in attendance, the US's Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin announced that support for Ukraine would be reviewed on a monthly basis.
Today's gathering will become a monthly contact group on Ukraine's self-defense. And the contact group will be a vehicle for nations of goodwill to intensify our efforts and coordinate our assistance and focus on winning today's fight and the struggles to come.
Since the start of Russia's invasion, weapons from the West have been pouring into Ukraine to bolster its position. Most of the supplies have come from the US. Washington has donated 5 billion euros worth of arms. France has given 100 million euros. The UK has sent more than 200 million, while Germany, for its part, has given nearly 120 million euros. Berlin has now ramped up its support following pressure from its allies. It announced Tuesday that it would send Gepard anti-aircraft tanks, marking a major shift in policy away from providing mainly defensive arms to sending heavy weaponry.
It is right that Germany delivers heavy weapons to Ukraine, as announced today. There was a change of the stance throughout the past week to deliver heavy weapons to Ukraine with Germany's support.
The flow of arms into Ukraine has enraged Moscow. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov warned of World War III if the West continued to supply Ukrainian forces. On Monday, Russia launched airstrikes at 5 railway stations in central and western Ukraine. The sites play a critical role in funneling foreign weapons into the country.
That report by Yinka Oyatade brings us up to speed. Let's bring in the guests now to talk more about this and go straight to Kyiv, to Peter Zalmayev, Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Peter, of course, right in the centre of what is happening. And Peter, thank you very much for joining us. Can I just ask you to give us your reaction to Sergei Lavrov's remarks that NATO is now involved in a proxy war?
Well, first of all, we've heard it all before, and the Russians have been making those threats since the beginning of the campaign. Vladimir Putin, in his initial speech, warned the West that whatever assistance they decide to provide Ukraine will lead to severe consequences from the Russians. That hasn't materialized. They have threatened to bomb Western convoys of weapons traveling into Ukraine. That hasn't happened, and now we're hearing from Sergei Lavrov that there's a serious risk of a World War III, which all it tells me is that the Russians are smelling imminent defeat. They have their threatened offensive in the Donbass, which was supposed to be shock and awe and reminiscent of World War II battles, hasn't really panned out the way they hoped. It's been happening in fits and starts. The Russians are clearly demoralized. They are not seeing a clear path to victory. And meanwhile, the May 9th date is coming up, which is the military victory over the Nazi Germany that the Russians celebrate. And there's going to be a military parade in Moscow. Putin's is desperate to have something. And And so Lavrov has really stepped up his rhetoric in order to try to scare the West into giving up on Ukraine, and it is not playing out the way they have hoped to.
Peter, for now, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Aglaya Snekov in London, lecturer at UCL, author of the book on Russian security policy and Vladimir Putin. Aglaya, thank you for joining us. Is there a sense that in the remarks that Sergei Lavrov makes that he's in some kind of a parallel universe and how he's viewing this situation?
I think I agree with your previous speaker. I think Peter's right. There is nothing new in the speech. It's an incredibly long interview, and it covers a lot of things that basically we've had it all before. What it does show is it shows sort of the Russian view on this point, which is that they do see developments in Ukraine essentially as a proxy war. That the NATO is waging against Russia, and the Russian public often actually does buy this particular narrative. This is sort of the repeat of the narrative of, the West is against us, we're doing nothing wrong. And Lavrov sort of reiterates this once again. So there is very much sort of the parallel universe. And I think the other element that Lavrov is trying to do is to sow uncertainty and sort of somewhat panic in terms of what Russia could do next. One of the things that Lavrov and Putin are quite good at is creating this image of sort of crazy Russia that could sort of go anywhere and do anything. So there's sort of World War III, there's talk of, what happened. It's not something mentioned in Lavrov's speech, but this is still this sort of what happened today, which is, what is happening in Moldova. But the reality is that Russia's not doing so well on the ground militarily in Ukraine. Trying to sow panic amongst Ukrainians or the West, I don't think is working. And I think this is sort of Lavrov trying to create a front of the dangerous Russia, which of course is waging a war in Ukraine and is devastating, but in practice is on the back foot. And more commentators are questioning whether or not they will, even succeed in their, let's say, so-called narrow aims in Donbass. But I think it's sort of a front from the Russian side. And in trying to push back against effectively the West, offering increasing support, much more effective support to Ukraine, and suggesting that, they're going in for sort of the long term.
Aglaya Snekov, for now, thank you very much indeed. Let's go to Christine Berzina in Washington from the German Marshall Fund for the United States. The US, Christine, really upping its support certainly in terms of the amount of money which is being sent. We've had another announcement from Tony Blinken on his recent discussion with Volodymyr Zelensky face-to-face when he went to see him in Kyiv. Lloyd Austin really reinforcing that sense that with the right support, Ukraine can win. Does this mean that the US is in it for the long haul?
The U.S. has shown tremendous commitment to Ukraine in this war that is only increasing. And there's a lot of U.S. motivation for other NATO partners, including for Germany, to also increase their commitments. The impetus, the momentum right now is on the Ukrainian side. And as we see this ongoing support now, increasingly more military aid, now structural formats in order for all supporting countries to come together and coordinate aid, there is a sense that the wind is in the Ukrainian sails, and the United States and other partners are going to help it cross that line. And we see that in the rhetoric, the language around winning this war. If you look back to the very first days, the end of February, the rhetoric wasn't, oh, how can Ukraine win? There was a terror of what this imagined Russia would bring down in Ukraine. The practical reality of Russia's faltering war effort, horrible casualties and atrocities, yes, but the fact that we can have from Secretary Austin the rhetoric of winning, the rhetoric of support, really shows the commitment and also the trajectory that the U.S. is trying to help Ukraine achieve.
Christine, for now, thank you very much indeed. So Christine Berzina at the German Marshall Fund for the U.S. in Washington there with the kind of upsum of what the U.S. is doing to help. Let's bring in Jean de Gliniasti, Director of Research here in France, to Iris, former ambassador to Russia. So thanks for being with us. We've heard about the parallel universe here with what Lavrov is saying and what everyone else is interpreting as a situation. Vladimir Putin, it's just coming into us here at France 24, telling Antonio Guterres, who is in Moscow, that he still has hope in Ukraine talks. When Putin says something like that, Does he mean it, or is he just trying to manipulate people?
Well, he tries to save the channel, that's all. Because obviously the Russians are waiting for getting a trump card before negotiating, and they didn't get it yet. Obviously also the Ukrainians are boosted by international support and military aid, and they have some real hope to repel the Russians. So I think the time has not come for negotiation, but everybody wants to keep alive the channel.
Do you think that is possible, though, with the way Putin behaves? Because Emmanuel Macron's tried to keep that sort of channel of communication open all the time. He's been criticised by many people for trying to do that, but he maintains that talking is the way ahead. And obviously one can see there's an advantage into having that communication open with Putin. But if Putin isn't an honest broker, if he isn't saying what the truth is, what's the point?
Well, anyway, it will... I mean, at the end of the game, we'll need some negotiation. So it's at least the European interest to keep alive this channel. I mean, you don't choose your interlocutor. He can be a liar, can be a cheat, but you need it. So, but the moment hasn't come. That's why we need to keep it alive.
Okay, Jean, thank you very much indeed. Peter, I'm coming to you next, but before that, let's take a listen now to the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and his words regarding Vladimir Putin on the issue of diplomacy.
We've seen no sign to date that President Putin is serious about meaningful negotiations. If he is, and if the Ukrainians engage, we'll support that.
Short, sweet, clear there from Blinken. Let's bring in Peter Zalmayev, Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Peter is joining us from Kyiv. Peter, thanks for being with us. I understand today several, I can't put a number on it, maybe you can help me. We know people have been killed in your country today. We know people in Kharkiv have been killed. We know people in Zaporizhia have been killed. We know these strikes are continuing. Can you give us a sense of what's happening where you are? Can you put numbers on how many people lost their lives today?
Well, there's probably, it's hard to say, precisely how many people have lost their lives today, simply because we don't know what is happening in Mariupol, just the scale of the disaster there. We have heard credible reports that the Russians have been, cremating people there to get rid of the evidence so that there will be not a repeat of the Bucha massacre that the world has seen. They're very mindful of repeating that. I'll just tell you general numbers, and the official numbers are at a huge variance with the reality. We've heard that there may have been a total of, let's say, the official figure, UN-provided figure, 2,000 something confirmed civilian death. That is far, far, far below the reality. We are hearing that there may be several, dozen thousands, tens of thousands of civilians dead in Mariupol alone. Whenever the German tabloid Bild before the war had a forecast in one of its issues saying that as many as 50,000 Ukrainians may die as a result of this conflict. This sounded fantastical to me, to a lot of people. It may already be a reality. We're just not seeing the true picture. We're going to have to see what happens when and if Mariupol is liberated. When it is going to be a matter of when, not if. And by the way, Mariupol is still standing. There's still hundreds of civilians trapped in the steel plant, etc. So the scale of this disaster is growing by the minute. And, obviously the Russian side is not acknowledging any of it at all.
Humanitarian corridors, Peter, just staying with you for a second here. Antonio Guterres has called for those and called on Ukraine and Russia to cooperate to make this happen. In your experience of what happens with humanitarian corridors and how Russia respects them, what has been your observation about what happens?
My observation has been that at every point of the way the Russians either use these corridors, to direct the flow of refugees towards Russia. They have repatriated. They have essentially stolen, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens. That's the latest calculation. A lot of them have been transported to as far out in Russia's Siberia as the Sakhalin island, and obviously they're using them for propaganda purposes to show the Russians that they're saving these people. And the second issue is that these humanitarian corridors are often used as, provocations. Russians have opened indiscriminate fire against civilians trying to flee, and as a result, we have significant numbers of people who were killed while the Russians ostensibly safeguarded their safety.
Peter, thank you for now. Antonio Guterres then meeting with Lavrov, then meeting with Vladimir Putin, the UN Secretary General telling Lavrov that he wants cooperation over humanitarian access to places like Mariupol. Let's listen to the words, well-meaning words, of Antonio Guterres.
And we urgently need humanitarian corridors that are truly safe and effective and that are respected by all to evacuate civilians and deliver much-needed assistance. To that end, I have proposed the establishment of a humanitarian contact group bringing together the Russian Federation, Ukraine and the United Nations.
And then Vladimir Putin saying to Guterres that there's hope in talks on Ukraine. Let's bring in Aglaia Snekov, lecturer at UCL in London, author of the book on Russian security policy and Vladimir Putin. More evidence of a parallel universe existing here, do you think, Aglaia?
So I think Guterres is clearly trying to keep the diplomacy going. And I think this is, from the UN's point of view, also somewhere where they see that they can effectively play a role. Clearly, the sort of discussions at the UN Security Council sort of failed and, came to nothing. UN has been largely sidelined over the course of this war, and there has been a lot of criticism of Guterres and the role of the UN for not doing anything. And I think this is here sort of Guterres trying to come in and show sort of what the UN can do, which is effectively to try and create humanitarian assistance for Ukraine. They have thousands of UN sort of workers on the ground in Ukraine, and this is perhaps something that they could actually offer assistance on. Because I think that this discussion of sort of diplomatic talks initiated by the UN at this stage will be going nowhere. But I think in terms of humanitarian assistance and trying to act as a go-between between the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, adding additional sort of know-how, pressure points, but also expertise around the questions of Mariupol, for example, is clearly something the UN are trying to do. If it works, I think this would be great work. This is clearly something that UN is expert in. Whether or not the Russians or whether or not Putin is going to, allow or enable the UN to play a greater role in this conflict, I am not so sure, because at this stage the Russians were very keen on sidelining the UN, despite Lavrov, in the earlier conversation we had, talking about the UN at length. In practice, the Russians have been happy to sideline the UN. So we will see over the next sort of few days the role that the UN will be trying to carve out for itself in this conflict.
Indeed. Aglaia, thank you very much indeed. There have already been 2 votes, of course, at the UN General Assembly to condemn what Russia is doing. One of the votes actually calling on Russia to leave, and that, of course, has been completely ignored. Hence, we're on day 62 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Special military operation, as it is described from Moscow, but the rest of the world, of course, seeing it for what it is. Christine Betzina, can I bring you back in from the German Marshall Fund of the US over there in Washington? So the UN sideline, as we've heard from Aglaia, we've heard, obviously, Guterres calling for humanitarian corridors. We've heard Peter talking about how these corridors have been disrespected, and that is putting it mildly. This whole proxy war thing coming from Lavrov, another attempt to obfuscate in some way, to confuse, to manipulate?
I think it's one way in order to try to allow Russia to come to that victory that Peter talked about at the beginning. Russia, if it wanted in good faith to stop this conflict, it could just leave. the conflict isn't it comes from one side. The side is Russia deciding to invade its neighbor because it didn't like the direction that it was going in and it felt it had the right to do so. Under these circumstances, for Russia to allow the UN to play a meaningful role, for it to draw this conflict to an end, I mean, President Putin could do that this minute if he wished to. They would have to do things in good faith. What is the outcome that Russia is seeking here? I think that's the very big question, and so many around the world are trying to figure that out. Initially, it was supposed to be a quick grab of the entirety of Ukraine, probably putting in a Russian-friendly government there. Now, what is the outcome that is most palatable? What is most desirable? Is it this reach across the south, across the east? When will Russia have achieved enough of that to put in a good faith effort at negotiation? We haven't seen that yet. And the fact that Russia is doing so poorly, and while it is doing so poorly, I don't see that it, while it thinks it can still have some kind of victory, that it will come to a table and come to a meaningful position. So many of these efforts that we are seeing, either Lavrov's discussions of the risk of World War III or this flirtation with the UN, all of it is buying more time. All of it is waiting for an outcome that could be good enough. And yet Russia is not getting it. For Ukraine, therefore, pushing as far as it can, getting as much support as it can, changing the actual situation on the ground will lead to the best possible outcome. In this situation, I don't think diplomatic negotiations nor other bartered negotiations are going to be very successful. What matters is what's going on the ground, and other lines are kept open in case there should actually be a good faith effort at some point.
Christine, thank you very much indeed. So, lines of communication kept open. That's possibly a role that Emmanuel Macron could play in this second term he's just been elected for. Again, news coming here, France 24. France says it backs Moldova. Aglaia was talking earlier about Transnistria, the situation in Moldova where Russian separatists apparently being roused, and it's not a coincidence, as some people are saying, and Moldova taking steps to make sure that its borders are secure. France backing Moldova, and John, I'll bring you in here, France backing Moldova in face of destabilization risks. The situation for France here. It's tricky, isn't it? Because we've spoken about how Emmanuel Macron should play this, and you agree, and I'm sure most people fair-mindedly agree that it's good to keep the channels of communication open with Vladimir Putin and with Sergei Lavrov, in spite of the parallel universe and the parallel discourse they appear to be sticking to regarding what is going on, calling this a proxy conflict now. Is there a sense that it was always a proxy conflict, that Putin used the Russian separatists, so-called Russian separatists in the Donbass, as his excuse to get in and try to snatch Ukraine? His aim was to get in and get Kiev within 72 hours, wasn't it? That didn't work.
Moldova is a very specific case because you have one part which is Romanian, speaks Romanian, and doesn't speak, well, speaks less Russian than Romanian. And you have a Russian part. And history, it looks like Ukraine because there is a divide between the countries. I think once Russia has the left bank of the Dniester, it's okay for them because all the Russians are here. So if Moldova, I think, in the Russian, I try to understand the Russian need.
We appreciate that.
If Moldova says they don't apply to NATO, which is the case presently, perhaps I'm mistaken, nobody knows. Nothing is completely rational in this story. But I think as long as Moldova abstain from asking membership for NATO, I think Moldova will not be invaded. And the eastern part, the west bank of the Dniester, is already Russian. So,
you think that Moldova will be safe in terms of what happens next?
Yes. I mean, well I'm not completely sure. But
I'm not going to hold you to that, but clearly you're reading the situation. It's not the same as what is happening in Ukraine. There's not the same pressing desire from Vladimir Putin to make sure that they can seize that land.
I would say the west bank of Dniester is the same thing at the west bank of Dnieper River. Because the West Bank has been Russian for centuries, and the Russian underestimated the patriotic sense of this population. They thought that history made this part of the country completely Russian, and it's not the case. And that's the big and bloody mistake they made.
Alarming, though, that it might be encroaching onto NATO territory. Alarming that it might be dragging NATO into this fully, as it were, basically, because once the
you are talking about Moldova.
Yeah, Moldova, because once
Yes.
you push further, you're getting into NATO territory, aren't you?
Yes, I mean, you know, there are two theories about that. If you ask membership for NATO, you sort of attract a Russian intervention. But on the other way, if you are not member of NATO, you don't benefit from Article 5, and so you don't benefit from the automatic commitment of the alliance. So it's very difficult. But I tend to think that at the present moment, if Moldova abstained from asking for membership, it would stay safe. Perhaps I'm mistaken, but that's my analysis.
Jean de Gliesti, former ambassador to Russia. Thank you for that insight into how Russia might be thinking. Let's hear now from the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. He, of course, was co-hosting the event in the airbase near Berlin earlier. Lloyd Austin says that basically the US is prepared to move heaven and earth to defend Ukraine. And let's take a listen to what else he was saying.
Well, you know, you've heard us say a number of times that that kind of rhetoric is very dangerous and unhelpful. Nobody wants to see a nuclear war happen. It's a war that, you know, where all sides lose. And so rattling of sabers and you know, dangerous rhetoric is clearly unhelpful and something that we won't engage in.
Lloyd Austin replying there to Sergei Lavrov's words, as well as the proxy war. He talked about the real threat of World War III, and of course he's made remarks, and Vladimir Putin's made remarks about the use of nuclear weapons in the past. Let's go back to Kyiv. Peter Zalmayev, director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, is there for us. Peter, you've seen this from the very beginning. You've observed every aspect of how this has changed your country and affected your fellow citizens. And you can give us probably the best insight that we could hope for into the situation across the Donbass right now. I know you can't tell us all about the whole 480 kilometers of front right across there from Kharkiv right down to Mariupol, but give us a sense of what is happening across that area. Can you give us some kind, fill in the gaps for us a little bit, please?
Well, I'll just say that, first of all, a lot of the civilians have finally heeded the call of the government and left that area. They did not want to stay, you know, and be, you know, caught in the middle of this war. They didn't want to hamper the efforts of the Ukrainian armed forces. So that's on the plus side. There's still a significant number, though, remaining, including members of my immediate family, my wife's family. They are smack in the middle of the war zone, with rockets whistling so far above their heads. They said, we're, you know, hunkering down, we're going to stay in the basement, you know, come what may. Well, that happens with a lot of the older people, conservative, you know, people who, you know, for one reason or another won't leave, you know. It is difficult to see how Russians, after having, you know, suffered a humiliating defeat in the Battle of Kiev, you know, have been able to regroup, freshen up in time for the second, you know, offensive. All indications are that Russians still are plagued by the same set of problems they were, you know, saddled with from the beginning: lack of morale, lack of discipline, a huge attrition rate. You know, Russians have lost over 10 generals and counting so far, and untold numbers, you know, of tanks destroyed, etc. And this is a huge, obviously, stretch of the front from Izium to Kherson. If you take it, you know, straight line, it's over, you know, 700 kilometers of, you know, front line. it is difficult to see what the strategy is, simply because it's just not a feasible kind of strategy. Russians are demoralized, their resources are getting depleted. Ukrainians, on the other hand, are getting all the sophisticated heavy weaponry now that you can imagine. So, some forecasts are saying that within 2 weeks, it will be pretty much a game over for Russians. I don't want to be too optimistic once again, but once again, I think I would connect the increasingly belligerent statements by the Russian, officials, including threatening World War III, with a very, very clear picture that there's going to be no outright military victory in the Donbass. And let me just add one more thing. This was supposed to be an area most friendly to the Russians. These are Russian speakers living there, mind you. People, and where did the Russians really start their campaign of terror against civilians? Against precisely in Kharkiv and Mariupol, Russian-speaking cities. So the population of this area has not greeted Putin with open arms and with flowers. They are very much against Russians as occupiers. And so, all of the elements on the ground there are against the invading forces.
Peter, I hope your family is safe. Thank you for telling us about that. And as you were speaking, we were seeing images from the front, trenches reminiscent of something you might have seen in World War I. That's how basic the combat is set to be there, very much a war of attrition. Aglaia Snekov in London, lecturer at UCL, author of a book on Russian security policy and Vladimir Putin. It's fair to say, Aglaia, and I think you've said this already, this wasn't how Putin planned it, was it?
No. We don't quite understand sort of what the extent to which Putin was conscious of what sort of what they were aiming at. No, I think the assumption was some sort of a element of shock and awe, and then something was going to happen. Again, it's we would say that the plan, and I think that Putin focusing on conflict rather than diplomatic negotiation probably started, with last summer. So I think we've been this war's been long in the making, but I think there is little understanding as to how the Russians thought that their sort of shock and awe attack at all fronts would somehow produce some result that they were hoping for. And I think the problem we have at the moment is the difficulty of not knowing what the Russian victory will look like, as your previous commentator has mentioned. And I think that's also the question that we had about Moldova, which is, I would say that in the case of Moldova, it's as much about Russia trying to meddle, trying to show that they can get into lots of different areas and threaten countries that are potentially interested in joining NATO. When in reality, right, the Russians have absolutely no capacity of moving on to Moldova. This is not militarily something they're able to do, having moved all their troops, as many as they could, eastwards. So again, you have this parallel universe. So on the one hand, the Russians would like to threaten and make everyone very afraid, whereas in practice, they're trying to amass their troops in Donbass as much as possible, and seeing whether they'll be able to actually gain anything in practice on the ground there. So, talk about Moldova is, of course, very significant, but in practice, it actually demonstrates the Russian lack of capacity, militarily speaking, on the ground in Ukraine in actually making, such gains.
Aglaia, we've heard from Peter, and it's come from the government in Kyiv that there's a sense that Russia is smelling defeat. And I'm wondering whether you might think, and obviously this is open to everybody on the panel, Aglaia, whether you might think that Lavrov's remark about proxy war is in some way a way of preparing some kind of narrative from his perspective, from Putin's perspective, that Russia is suddenly being put upon by all fronts, by all possible allies, everyone's against them, so therefore they can't continue with this conflict because really they're outnumbered and bullied in some way into stopping. Is there something in that, do you think, in terms of what Lavrov's thinking might be, Putin's thinking might be?
So I don't think the discussion about proxy war is a new one. Actually, that just goes with the normal narrative the Russians have been putting forward for years and decades now, that, the West is against them, that countries such as Ukraine, such as Moldova, such as Georgia, they don't make their own foreign policy. The Americans do that for them. So this is actually part of the usual narratives the Russians put forward. The question that will be interesting to see is this a way of make it more palatable to the Russian public? The sanctions have been placed upon the Russian public, the defeats that the Russians are seeing on the ground, Or, and I'm not saying this is likely in any way, does this actually prepare the Russian public for a general mobilization? Because, it's one thing to require the army for a special operation, but, if we're fighting NATO, if we're fighting the West, if we're fighting the US, then, then maybe Russia should mobilize. Now, I don't think we're there in terms of Putin mobilizing the Russian population, but there has been a lot of talk about how one of the major problems the Russian military is encountering is lack of personnel. Essentially, they need more manpower. And at the moment, Putin has been very reluctant in, calling for general mobilization or for preventing the draftees from going home with a spring draft. But so at this stage, we don't know. Is it the Russians sort of acknowledging their defeats on the ground? Or is it, on the other hand, trying to prepare the Russian public for actually a much greater offensive where many more of them would need to be involved?
Aglaia Snekov, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Christine Batzina in Washington at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Christine, just to sort of start you off here, we're hearing, again, this is Vladimir Putin being quoted as saying the situation in Mariupol is tragic. He hasn't said that it's of his making, but he says it's tragic. This is him quoted by a Spanish news service. And also we're hearing that Gazprom, the gas company, obviously linked to the Kremlin, has halted deliveries to Poland via the Yamal pipeline. This coming from the Polish pipeline operator. Poland considering perhaps taking them to court if this proves to be a breach of contract, which sounds kind of fatuous, but again, another aspect of Russia being an outlaw.
Yes, and so the way that Russia tries to put in influence and exert influence on others are through the issues like energy. So far, we have generally seen deliveries continue, although it's not always the same volume day to day. And so what happens one day to another is not necessarily a trend. So we'll again watch what happens in particular pipelines. Russia has always been much more willing to cut off flows to countries it feels are in its periphery or in what it should be its sphere of influence, as opposed to Germany or Italy. Different rules apply there. So again, watch this, because the playbook that Russia has always used for either the Baltic states or for Poland, Ukraine certainly, the Balkans, that's very different from what it feels it can and should be doing to the Germans and the Italians on energy supplies. That is what, so important to watch that, but thus far they have delivered. There's more discussion in Europe about saying this is not a good situation to begin with, and maybe we should not be buying that gas at all in the future, and just start to do that quickly. So that is a bit of the dynamics in that particular field. President Putin calling what is happening in Mariupol tragic. What story about what is happening in Mariupol? So much of the story that gets told to Russia, and there's a question, how much of this does President Putin actually believe, is that the Ukrainians are attacking themselves in Mariupol, right? That the demonized Ukrainians, the Nazis, as he frequently has called them, that they are the ones perpetuating this attack. And when images of the Russian attack on Ukraine have been portrayed as Ukrainian attacks on Ukraine to the Russian public, is that what President Putin thinks of as tragic? Does it help him to empathize publicly with Ukrainians that are being purportedly attacked by Ukrainians? I would not necessarily take his understanding this as a tragedy as any kind of reflection on his responsibility or the Russian responsibility in Ukraine. Again, his reality, the reality he wants to portray to the Russian people, can be very different from the reality on the ground, though can use many of the same images and materials that we see, that we have verified, but they wish to tell a different story. And how far Putin truly believes in his ability to win, this also plays into these questions. What is his strategy? What is his end game? And what is his true understanding about his options on the ground right now? Because in a heavily propagandized environment, what are the checks and balances on the information available to him? And that, of course, can lead many of us to worry about the next steps here.
Indeed, that whole issue about communication, about what story is being told, about what narration is being peddled, and of course this aspect of a parallel reality, which appears to be more and more apparent with remarks such as proxy war coming from Sergei Lavrov. Christine, thank you very much indeed. Let's come back to the studio. Jean de Gliniesti, Director of Research at IRIS and former ambassador to Russia. Thank you, sir, for patiently waiting for your next intervention. And I'll set you free here on this one. I mean, the move by Gazprom, clearly, we see that as a provocation.
I'm sorry, what move?
Stopping the gas supply into Poland. Again, another aspect of this.
I wasn't aware. It's the last news?
It's just come in, yeah. It's just come in now. It's new. It's just dropping here.
That's interesting because it shows that, in fact, of course, we have a leverage on gas on Russia, but Russia has a leverage. It's interesting to notice that nobody criticized too much Germany, for instance, to keeping alive the Druzhba,
well, Germany's reliance on Russian gas is so great, and clearly Germany's position was much criticized, wasn't it? It's only now that Germany has really come on board in terms of supplying heavy weapons.
Yes, but this gas pipeline, in fact, brings $1 billion to Ukraine, and also allows Ukraine to keep some gas from Russia. So, in fact, it was saved. It was saved because nobody talks about that, because, in fact, Ukraine needs it. As regards Poland, it's pure retaliation. And it's more than a provocation, it's a retaliation. And it shows also to other clients of Russian gas that Russia could stop the gas tap.
Poland says supplies are secure. That's the latest that's just dropped there. So clearly people in Poland will be getting their energy supply and obviously heating, cooking. That will be secure for now. But of course, Jean, we don't know what happens next, do we? Thank you very much. Let's bring Peter back in. Peter in Kyiv from the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Peter, of course, his family, as he told us earlier, in the firing line. He currently in Kyiv, and you've been in the firing line, sir, I know, because we've spoken before. We're seeing here a claim from Russia that Kherson, the entire Kherson region, is now under Russian control. Russian Defense Ministry says Ukraine has lost control of the entire Kherson region. Do we see that as being fact? Is this another aspect of a parallel universe, such as the one that's been spoken about by Sergei Lavrov?
Well, yes, I would just revert, back to my previous statement that Russians are desperate to come up with something for May 9. They need some tangible victories to present to make it all worthwhile. We do know that the mayor, the mayor's office of Kherson may have been taken over by the Russians. They took down the Ukrainian flag. They are largely controlling the capital of the region, Kherson itself. But as far as controlling the entire area, that is a very dubious statement. You have to understand that there's a nascent guerrilla movement, partisan warfare that is happening in those areas. Obviously, the Russians will not report on that. They do not control all of the population centers there. They do not control all of the roads. There's still lots of Ukrainian saboteurs. And in some parts of the Kherson area, the Ukrainians have reported successful counterattacks, and even some cities, liberated. So it's a very mixed bag. The situation is fluid, and once again, we are dealing with in a fog of war with battling, narratives here. So it would be too early to say, but once again, I would just say that just like with Mariupol, where Russians have claimed that they have finally taken it, there are still those hundreds of fighters and civilians in that steel plant, and the hundreds of bombs the Russians are throwing at them still have not done the trick of smoking them out. They're still there, and for as long as they're there, Mariupol is technically not taken. And I would say the same thing applies to the situation in the Kherson area.
Peter Zalmayev, thank you very much indeed, Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. That's all we've got time for on this debate. Peter, thank you. Thanks to Christine Betsina joining us from Washington, Senior Fellow and Head of the Geopolitics team at the Alliance for Security and Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Christine, thanks for your contributions. Thank you to Aglaia Snekov, lecturer at UCL, author of the book on Russian security policy and Putin. Aglaia, thank you. And thanks to my guest in the studio, Jean de Gliniesti, Director of Research at IRIS and former ambassador to Russia. Appreciate your thoughts and your analysis. Thanks to you all for taking part, and thanks to you for watching too. Stay with us. This is Live in Paris.